Approaches like police and barricades may resolve the problem temporarily, I think, but even the police, we have to keep in mind that these are drive-by shootings that happen less than a minute. When the police arrive, everybody's already gone.
A public commenter there from the Aurora Avenue North neighborhood, Kendall Gregory, questioning the city's new plan to put temporary barriers in that area to disrupt prostitution and gun violence. How's that plan going to work out? Plus, the resignation of a top official from the mayor's team, and even more shakeup ahead, as the mayor of Seattle has to select a candidate for a very important and sometimes controversial role. All that and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I wanted to make sure I asked you this reporting question, because you're a pretty intrepid reporter. Have you found a way onto Mark Zuckerberg's yacht out on Lake Union yet?
I have not, but my wife and I had a date on Saturday, and we were biking around town and biked past the yacht. And there were only just like two kind of disaffected looking security guards standing in the way. It is also the craziest piece of machinery I've ever seen in my entire life. You hear about it, have someone having $1 billion, and that sounds like a lot until you see what that can actually buy, and then you realize just how much money that is.
Hey, baby, let's go to our date down the street. Yeah. I've been on that ride before too. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, and thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our patrons, Mark, this week renewing his pledge to support the show. Thank you, sir. If you want to be a voice for locally crafted journalism, be a patron, why don't you? Go to Patreon, pledge to help out. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. Works out to a little more than $1 a show. You'll also have access to Patrons First podcasts and even get this cool-looking decal. How about that? Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon, and please help support the show. A shout-out to Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, it's go time. Let's do it. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, our top story again this week, the city's plans to improve public safety on Aurora Avenue North. This was announced late last week, and over the weekend, some barriers that were set up by residents to actually block traffic and reduce gun violence in that way. Imagine being in that neighborhood. Those have been replaced by city calming treatments, as they're called by the Seattle Department of Transportation. So these are concrete barriers that still allow cars to get through, but not as easily. They're spaced out so cars are kind of forced to weave their way past them. Are they working? Well, My Northwest reports maybe not exactly. More gunshots reported on Sunday morning. Shell casings found 50 feet from a daycare. David, I wanted to follow up on this because the city is clearly trying to bear down on this issue. We're going to talk about some of the legislation they're working on in a minute. It's just not that often that within 24 hours of an announcement, the city crews actually do it, take action like this, set up barricades. What do you make of this barricade piece of it in terms of what the city's trying to do here? Is this going to work, I think, is my big question.
I don't know if it's going to work. I couldn't necessarily guess that. The barricade thing is fascinating in a way because it is sort of like the perfect example of when people talk about public safety measures that do not involve law enforcement. Changing environment in the built environment is kind of a preferred alternative to just flooding the zone with more police. We hear a lot about that downtown, and the term they often use is activating, and they kind of change Westlake Park, for example, or put up some lights along 3rd Avenue. It's interesting to see it being used on Aurora Avenue, because I think there's some feeling that Aurora is unchangeable, or at least the area near Aurora, that it is like a very cast in stone built environment that would be difficult to change. So, it's an interesting experiment in some ways of the city doesn't have a lot of disposable police officers to spend all of their time in this particular area. And so they're resorting to something that actually, during 2020 and some of the police protests, a lot of people were making the argument that this was the preferred approach to public safety, is changing the environment, making it so that it discourages the sort of behavior that you want or don't want.
Yeah, we've seen it, I think, in some neighborhoods. I'm thinking South Seattle, they'll set up some different concrete blocks, businesses will, to keep RVs from parking there from people who might be homeless. I think there's some connections there, too.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be interesting to see if this makes a difference. It seems like it could lead to a situation too where it's not exactly the SOAP laws of the stay out of area prostitution enforcement, but maybe you close it and then you've kind of created a pretext in a way to crack down on the sort of activity that you might not want. Because, I mean, the challenge with a place like Aurora or this particular area is you can only act on something when it becomes criminal.
Right.
But ideally, you want to prevent the crime from happening in the first place.
Yes.
It's a tough situation to crack down on people who are just hanging out because that kind of smacks of broken windows policing, or, there's just like, if somebody is there but not doing anything illegal, you can't arrest them for just standing there.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is the nexus and origin of these additional laws that you layer on top. So you give law enforcement some reason or some other sort of lower level offense that they can enforce, and then the idea being you kind of reduce the overall negative activity in the area. That will sound like broken windows policing to some people, and of course raise questions about civil rights, but in this particular case, people are pretty desperate up there. It sounds like it's a really bad situation, and it'll be interesting to see if this particular approach makes a difference.
Yeah, and clearly, I mean, when you have neighbors like putting out planters and stuff in the middle of their streets, their own streets that they live on, to try to stop this activity from happening, you get an idea of kind of what's going on up there. The city's trying to work with this. I did want to take it one step further with you here, because the city is now considering this emergency legislation that would allow the police chief to recommend temporary closures of a road or alley to prevent criminal activity. Councilmember Juarez talking about this for her district, discussing barriers for 30, 60, 90 days possibly. Take me down that next step, David. What do you think about this approach, some of the pros and cons the city has to consider with allowing the police chief to have this kind of power to shut down streets in this way?
Yeah, I mean, again, it is a broader stroke than having emphasis patrols there, just to shut down a whole street. That's a big authority. We've seen more kind of authority vested into the police and fire chiefs, around vacant buildings and their ability to condemn them, or nuisance properties. And so this grows the power of the police chief. I could see some people being a little uneasy with that. Again, I don't think those people are the ones who live around this area. I'm sure they were happy, would be happy for the police chief to have this authority. Yeah. And again, when you were talking about sort of there's kind of general activity that the belief is that then that leads to criminal activity.
Sure.
It is a challenging thing to prevent the kind of general activity in the first place. I think the thought is giving the police chief the power to shut down a street and then enforce that, which is a lower level offense than prostitution or sex trafficking or gun violence.
Yep.
By doing that kind of lower level enforcement of saying, hey, you're not allowed to be here, the street is closed, you sort of maybe get ahead of the worst stuff, the more criminal stuff. There are a lot of questions tied to that, again, around civil liberties and the level of authority for a police chief to have. But I don't think those criticisms would necessarily come from the people who are living in that area who are feeling sort of desperate. Yeah,
they're in emergency mode. It certainly feels like now. That's why the city's talking about this emergency legislation. Look for more details there in just a couple weeks. All right, another follow-up here on a story that hit late last week with regard to Sound Transit and its light rail system, which will indeed not be heading to Ballard anytime soon. We discussed that. However, the Graham Street station in South Seattle, which looked like it was going to get cut just a few weeks ago, that one is back in the mix. And David, we discussed Seattle City Council member Dan Strauss's gambit last week, asking Sound Transit to prioritize building out to Ballard rather than building that second downtown tunnel. Strauss's idea failed there. I just wanted your final thoughts on with what Sound Transit came up with, and maybe starting with that Ballard piece, if you could. I know we talked about this. Maybe it's going to work, maybe it's not, but it clearly fell flat.
Yeah, the Ballard piece felt like a kind of Hail Mary, I think, from Dan Strauss. I'm sure he probably knew that. He has been the most vocal around what he sees as kind of the egregious decision to cut Ballard from the system. What, at the end of the day, this comes down to is the board thought that the suburban leadership, is in a perfect world, everything gets funded, everything gets built. Right. The conclusion was we no longer live in that world. Things have to be cut. We have to find a way to make this math equation work. And so then in some ways that then therefore became a fight over resources between, elected people from Pierce, King, and Snohomish counties. Yeah. The people from Pierce and Snohomish counties seem to have won this fight. Graham Street Station returning is a positive for Seattle. It's a little easier to do because it's an infill station on a line that already exists.
Surface level too. No tunnel digging there. Yeah.
That's relatively low impact. But, the lines to the north and south got to keep some of their stuff, and Ballard, which you could, the neighborhood of Ballard probably, I don't know exactly, but I think probably has a bigger population than
Yeah.
Linwood,
Yeah.
doesn't get its line. And
Yeah.
I think in some ways it's a major political loss for the politicians of Seattle and the people of Seattle, and also one that I think we've seen coming for a while.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was just looking up some of the details there on Linwood versus Ballard there. They're really close in terms of population there. Actually, it looks like Ballard would have a little bit more. Interesting. Just want to make sure I followed up on that.
Yeah.
The other piece that I thought was interesting from this meeting last week was it was one of the first times that we really heard this talk for potentially more revenue here. The Transit Board discussing some possible new taxes, again, to support a system that's $35 billion in the red. Mayor Wilson actually had an amendment to look at a future revenue package. I'm putting that in big old air quotes there. What does that tell you, David?
I mean, when you're out of money, there's two options. It's to cut or get more money.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising, particularly coming from Mayor Wilson. It's not like Pierce and Snohomish counties voted overwhelmingly in favor of Sound Transit. And there's a reason why the line is built in the way it is to get more buy-in from those counties, because this is a tri-county government body. This is not Seattle, where basically tax measures are almost guaranteed to pass. That's not necessarily the case.
Imagine if they did cut out Linwood. Imagine if they did cut out Pierce County. What kind of hue and cry we'd hear then, for sure.
Exactly. But it's looking at how basically poorly this has gone. It's hard to argue that it has gone even close to what people wanted it to. There were all these promises of what it was going to do, and it's not going to do a lot of those. I think a future revenue package, or AKA Sound Transit 4, has a pretty tough argument to make, because in a lot of ways what it would be doing is saying, hey, we want to pay for the things we told you the last one would pay for. That's not a sexy sell. I think the fact that we're talking in terms of certain stations being built in 2050, it's not an overstatement to say that a lot of the people who will be voting for this are going to be dead by then.
Yikes,
Or at least, maybe don't imagine that they will be living here anymore, or be at a very different place in their lives. I just don't think, I think it's going to be a tough sell to people that they need more money to do the things they already promised to do in 30 years. Getting more money, I don't think, is a guarantee. I think they probably understand that, which is why they're making the decisions around what to cut right now.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. Up next, more questions for the mayor as her top advisor on one of her signature efforts, adding more emergency shelter spaces, has stepped down. What's going on? What does this mean for this project? Some details next on Now Hear This. Well, a shakeup in Mayor Katie Wilson's office within the past few days. John Grant, her policy lead on rolling out 1,000 new shelter spaces within the first year of her term, well, he's resigned after just a few months on the job. Grant came in with a lot of energy to support the city and spoke glowingly about the city's efforts with the housing levy and the social housing developer when I spoke to him about his new role and our region's affordable housing crisis back in January.
I think there's all these new tools that are at our disposal to make sure that we can make Seattle affordable for all. And that has been a commitment and a promise that this mayor has made to the city. And you'll be hearing more announcements to advance that mission and vision in the coming months.
David, John Grant sounded to me like a guy who was, at least initially, very much on the mayor's team, very supportive of what she was doing. Why is he resigning?
Well, it kind of depends on who you ask and in what context you ask that.
All right.
There are two interpretations, and I'll give them both, and you can decide which one is true.
All right.
The one is his latest task was to help pass 3 pieces of legislation from Mayor Katie Wilson to help expand shelter in Seattle. We've talked about those 3 pieces involving who can lease land and how big encampments can be and how much money the city would budget towards that.
Yeah.
All 3 of those bills have now passed. They are going to become law. And so the generous interpretation is his immediate task has been completed, and now he's going to move on and go back to the sort of work he was doing before he joined the mayor's office.
Yeah.
The less generous interpretation is in the process of passing those bills, the Wilson administration has made a lot of enemies on the second floor in council chambers. The city council is broadly quite unhappy with how the mayor's office is interacting with them and their processes, particularly staff members. And I think John Grant is part of that. We saw a few weeks ago that Mayor Wilson essentially demoted her longtime friend and chief of staff and promoted somebody who has much more rapport with the members of the city council. And, John Grant, I think, could be lumped into that same category of somebody who maybe didn't have the best interactions with members of the council. And Mayor Wilson is trying to course correct before she sees things spiral out of control.
Yeah, I hear you. I did want to talk about keeping things in control when it comes to this effort to add 1,000 new shelter units. Now that Grant has stepped down, what happens with that program? What do you think?
I think it's going to move forward. Grant, the thing that he had that was unique and I think valuable to the mayor's office is he worked for the Low Income Housing Institute.
Lehigh, he'd been there for a while, yeah.
Which some people took issue with, frankly, because a lot of this new shelter space is probably going to go to Lehigh, and there was some feeling that maybe that was a conflict of interest. That question aside, there was no doubt he had experience and knowledge in how you stand up shelter, particularly modular shelter, RV sites, tent encampment sites, tiny home villages. Short of Sharon Lee at Lehigh, he might have been the most qualified person in the city to understand how that stuff works.
Sure.
So him leaving, it does raise the question of kind of who takes that space. It probably matters that the city now has more authority to directly sign its own leases. I think there's probably now more experts in there who have a little more authority than they did before, who can do some of this work. Separate from John Grant, though, the getting to 1,000 units was always going to be hard. It's still hard. Whether or not John Grant leaving makes it harder, I couldn't say for sure. I think it probably does improve the working relationship with the council, but you do lose a little bit of expertise in how you actually build this stuff.
Does it sour the relationship with Lehigh at all? What do you think?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think Sharon Lee is
the executive director. Keep going. Yeah,
is pretty dogged in her pursuit of opening new shelter, and I think she will work with whomever is willing to do that. And my sense is that John Grant doesn't feel like he's leaving on bad terms.
Okay.
I don't think this is going to be some grudge between them. I think there's an acknowledgement that some things have not gone particularly well as far as relations go.
Yeah.
I think that's a widely accepted thing within City Hall now, and probably broadly understood that it made some sense to make some staffing changes. So I don't see John Grant as going to burn a bunch of bridges on his way out necessarily.
Yeah, and I know we're talking a lot of inside baseball here, folks, but sometimes these are the different power structures and relationships that make things happen in the city. So, David, I appreciate you jumping on that with me. I did want to talk about a few more housekeeping issues for the mayor to deal with. And, David, you were writing about this recently in the Seattle Times. Here we are talking about housing, and Mayor Wilson has yet to name a candidate for the director of the Office of Housing, which oversees the $970 million housing levy, among other duties. From your reporting, what I gleaned from that was a lot of housing providers, especially affordable housing providers, including Lehigh, are concerned about that. What's going on here?
This was a mayor who ran on affordability, particularly affordability in housing. Not all of that runs through the Office of Housing. Some of it involves private market development and that sort of thing. But a big piece of the affordability conversation is city subsidized and city paid for housing. And that portfolio goes through the Office of Housing. And there are some pretty big decisions that need to be made going forward around how you spend that money, where you emphasize what sort of housing you're trying to build, not to mention questions around the mandatory housing affordability program, which is the kind of height for fees, grand bargain deal, what you do with that. So there's some kind of big open-ended questions, not to mention just a lot of affordable housing providers who are struggling and want somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there isn't a person there yet, nor has there been a nominee even announced, I would say is surprising to me, considering how important this issue was on the campaign trail. And remember, the Micah Winkler-Chin, the head of the Office of Housing, was fired in January. So it's been 4 months at this point, and we haven't had a replacement.
Yeah.
It wasn't surprising to me that she was fired. It is surprising to me that a replacement hasn't been named, because again, there are just a lot of really big questions around the health of the affordable housing sector that need kind of a point person that just doesn't exist yet. And I think for a lot of providers and developers, it's a point of frustration that they just kind of don't have a lot of insight into what the next year is really going to look like under this future unknown housing director.
Yeah, just can't even imagine what it's like from that affordable housing provider perspective right now, because we're talking about this bit of a strange relation with the mayor's office when it comes to the Office of Housing. We're talking about some huge problems with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority that we've talked about over the past couple of weeks here. So there's a lot going on in this space. I did want to point out one other point that you brought up in your piece here. You mentioned that the largest union of city workers, Protect 17, is looking to have a voice in the selection of this director role. And I'm sure the mayor is listening to Protect 17, but how much of a role do you see this union having in that actual selection? What would it mean to give Protect a role like that? What do you make of what's going on there?
Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit, and I think maybe speaks to a larger conversation or something I should write maybe around.
I'm here to help, David. Keep going. Yes.
ProTech 17, I think, has more of a claim than pretty much anybody that they helped get Katie Wilson elected, because they were the first union to endorse her, and they did so. And they were the only union to endorse her before the primary.
Yeah.
A lot of endorsements came after the primary when she exceeded expectations, but
Right.
ProTech was the only one to really kind of stick its neck out there and
Good
take
point.
a risk to endorse against their boss, Bruce Harrell. It was a significant thing.
Right.
And I think as a result, they feel like they should have a strong voice in Mayor Wilson's administration. And so in this case, you have staff members, about 40 of them, in the Office of Housing, sending a letter to Mayor Wilson on union letterhead saying, not only do we want to be involved in the selection, we kind of want final vote here. I don't know if that is being honored. The mayor's office didn't really address that when I asked them about it.
That feels a little dangerous to me, don't you think?
That is not typical. That has not been the case. It is very common for union voices to be in search committees or advisory groups and play a role in the
very
selection.
influential. Yes.
But to actually have a kind of final vote on who gets selected, that is more significant than anything I've ever seen before.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, I haven't heard that is being acknowledged, but I do think maybe it's good context for the kinds of conversations that are happening around this job. And frankly, it's sort of easy to imagine yourself as mayor coming in and saying, I'm going to get rid of this person and I'm going to bring in the person that I like the most to run this job. The reality is, whenever there's an opening, she is hearing from a lot of different people on every opening saying,
oh, yeah.
She's hearing from private market developers. She's hearing from affordable housing developers. She's hearing from unions. It is a competition for her ear. And I think the reason I included that union piece in there wasn't to say that the union is for sure going to get a final vote here, but just kind of to illustrate the jockeying that goes on whenever you have this sort of important opening. And the calculations that she has to make of who is she listening to, who has the most important voice, particularly a young mayor like her, not young in age, but young in months on the job,
experience,
who hasn't perhaps fully crystallized exactly her triaging flowchart process yet.
Right.
You could imagine the unions and a lot of other interests seeing her as somebody that they feel like they can influence and can get their voice in. So, I thought that was why that was kind of an interesting tidbit.
Yeah, I think so too. It's so interesting to watch that play out there. I know that they were really pushing back when it came to the city light director that was selected. We've talked about that over the past couple of months too, so we'll see what unfolds there. Thank you for that, David. Coming up, a new transit proposal from the mayor of Seattle coming to a ballot box near you. We'll see about that. That story coming up on What's Next. We are getting some new details this week on the mayor's plan to renew the Seattle Transit Measure. If you don't remember this, voters approved the last version of this in 2020 with a 0.15% sales tax that paid for expanded bus service on King County Metro routes, free and subsidized transit passes, and some capital improvements, too. If the council says yes to the new proposal from the mayor and voters say yes, too, that tax would double to 0.3% in March of next year and raise about $138 million annually, the mayor's office said. David, 80% of voters said yes to this in 2020, but wow, we've been talking about a lot of doubling down on levies these days. I know we're just getting this information, but what's your take on the mayor's proposal here?
This is the founder of the Transit Riders Union. I am not surprised that the transit measure that she's proposing is bigger. This one is, you can always make the argument that the property tax measures are regressive, though there's a decent argument that there's some of it's kind of half regressive, half not. Sales tax is only regressive. It is the most regressive tax. It falls disproportionately. The less money you make, the harder it hits you. And so, this is a calculation a lot of Seattle politicians make. They will have some nod or acknowledgement towards the regressivity. They'll say, I am sympathetic to concerns around affordability. And yet they will propose a larger measure anyway. The calculation is a lot of the people who would be paying the sales tax measure would benefit from increased transit service, that it serves many of the lower income people who might be hit the hardest. That's probably true. I do think that there is a lot of demand for transit service. In Seattle, that it is, at least pre-pandemic, was one of few cities in the country where transit use was growing. It is a robustly used network, and I think probably not current issues at, say, King County Metro, budget issues at King County Metro, they have some pretty existential questions too. And, a measure like this kind of helps sustain the level of service that I do think a lot of people living in Seattle want.
Yeah.
It is a trade-off because there is no beating around the bush that this is a tax that lands harder on poor people than it does on rich people. That's a tough sell. Again, I mean, maybe not a tough sell. It's probably going to pass because these things always pass. But
yeah,
it is a trade-off that we're watching in real time that Katie Wilson is making, saying, I think that regressivity is worth what it buys.
Yeah. And I know we're getting closer to that levy cap that we've talked about on the program before over the past couple months. There's only a certain amount that the city can raise when it comes to these property taxes. I guess in looking at that piece of it, the council definitely was wringing its hands quite a bit over the library levy. Do you expect to see some pushback from the council on this one? It's kind of a here we go again, and I wondered what your thought was about that.
Yeah, again, it's like...
Maybe pushback is the wrong word.
Maybe there will be pushback, there will be concern, and it will probably proceed anyway.
Okay,
because,
okay.
I think there's more political risk in being an elected person who cuts transit service than there is in being somebody who proposes a tax measure like this.
Yeah.
Again, I think that is genuinely reflective of the electorate. I think most people in the city are willing to pay more in taxes for more transit service. We have data on this because from the last transit measure, I would expect that this one will pass as well.
Yeah.
It will not go unacknowledged, though, that the person who ran on affordability is making Seattle kind of by definition, at least in the day-to-day act of buying stuff around Seattle, this is going to make it a little more expensive. You can argue that it will make it cheaper for the people who use transit regularly because there's going to be more ORCA subsidies and people will save time because there's going to be more transit trips. So there will be hand-wringing and then it'll probably go to the ballot as is. I wouldn't think the council would actually get in the way of this.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so either. But I mean, these costs are real. I know there was something that the mayor actually looked at as well in terms of how much this would actually cost. This is something. The current levy costs about $29 annually for the median household. The new version would cost about $58 a year. So maybe not a huge cost, some people would say, but it definitely adds up. All right, David, we definitely need to wrap up here. I wanted to make sure I asked you about the Mariners, as we like to discuss. The Mariners are hot, and I think I have figured out the magic formula. Great pitching, a bunch of home runs, and then you just win the game in extra innings. It's fun and 100% sustainable. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, yes. There's no... yeah. If the Mariners are anything, they're a lucky organization, and I'm sure that luck will never run out.
That's a spirit. That's what we love to hear on this show. Thank you, David, as always. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where if you're lucky enough, you can find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron by checking out the Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks for the help there. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might be listening. And who are the 851 people in Germany who've done that? I don't know. But danke schön. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.